Good morning, sir. Can you see and hear us?
Yes, I can. Before we start hearing evidence, Ms. Price, I have an announcement to make about evidence gathering relating to the final phase of this inquiry. So I propose to make that announcement now, all right?
Yes, sir.
As core participants and members of the public will be aware, the final phase of the inquiry, phase 7, is concerned essentially with the here and now. I will be inquiring into such questions as, how does the post office treat its sub-postmasters? What is the culture of the post office like now? How does that culture compare with the culture prevailing before the group litigation? How do those who are entitled to compensation view their experiences of making claims? Has the post office and government delivered on its promise to provide compensation which is full and fair? In order to help me answer these questions, I have commissioned YouGov, an independent research and data analytics firm, to conduct 2 surveys. One survey is aimed at current sub-postmasters. The second survey is for those who have applied for compensation under the Horizon Shortfall Scheme. I want to hear from all of those persons to whom these surveys will be sent. As people with direct experience of the topics covered by the surveys, they are best placed to provide me with invaluable information about key issues relating to current practices within the post office and how the largest compensation scheme has operated in practice. To current sub-postmasters, let me make one thing clear. I know full well it can be difficult to speak about the challenges you have faced or still face at work or in your claims for compensation. Let me assure you that these surveys are in no way connected to the post office. They are anonymous, and no individual will be identified when the findings are published. Some of the applicants to the Horizon Shortfall Scheme will have negotiated compensation payments with Post Office on a without prejudice basis. I am pleased to be able to report that Post Office has agreed to waive the legal privilege which attaches to such negotiations, specifically for these surveys. This means that those applicants who conducted negotiations on a without prejudice basis can share their experiences when responding to the surveys without fear of repercussions. I want to make public too that Post Office, at the inquiry's request, will shortly be writing to all applicants to the historic shortfall scheme, inviting them to waive their legal privilege in respect of certain information about the scheme. The Post Office is taking that step so as to enable it to answer requests for information which the inquiry has requested it should provide. I urge all applicants to the scheme to respond positively to this letter, so the inquiry is given as much information as possible on how the scheme is running. The answers which are provided to the surveys will be treated as formal evidence to the inquiry and they will be analysed by YouGov in a report. Such a report will, I have no doubt, help to make sure valuable lessons can be learned. From this week, some 16,000 people will be contacted directly via email. The surveys can be completed online or over the telephone for those who need reasonable adjustments. If you are both a current sub-postmaster and you applied for compensation under the Horizon Shortfall Scheme, you will receive 2 separate survey links, one for each survey. Let me conclude by saying this. Human stories are at the heart of this inquiry. As will be obvious by now, and as I have said from time to time, I have been deeply affected by the accounts of the hardship and suffering endured by many. I urge all those who are contacted to complete the surveys, and I offer my heartfelt thanks now to all those who take the time and trouble to do so. Thank you, Ms. Price. We can now resume with the evidence on phases 5 and 6.
Thank you, sir. Please may we call Sir Stephen Lovegrove.
Yes, of course.
I do solemnly,
sincerely and truly
declare and affirm that the evidence I shall give shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
Could you confirm your full name, please, Sir Stephen?
Steve.
The statement which you have in advance of today. You should have a hard copy of that witness statement on the desk in front of you. Do you have that?
I do.
It is dated the 14th of June 2024. If you could turn to page 56 of that document, please.
Yes,
Do you have a copy with a visible signature?
I do.
Is that signature yours?
It is.
Are the contents of that statement true to the best of your knowledge and belief?
They are.
For the purposes of the transcript, the reference for Sir Stephen's statement is WITN 110-10100. Sir Stephen, your witness statement is now in evidence and will be published on the inquiry's website in due course. As such, I will not be asking you about every aspect of that statement, just certain specific issues which are addressed within it. Okay?
Understood.
I'd like to start, please, with your professional background and the roles you have held which are relevant to the matters being explored by the inquiry. You explain in your statement that upon graduation you worked at a small management consultancy specialising in the media sector, where you remained for around 3 years. Is that right?
That's correct.
Then from 1993 to 2003, you worked in investment banking at the bank Morgan Grenfell, working in its media team.
That's correct.
In early 2004, you joined the shareholder executive, working under the then chief executive, Richard Gillingwater. Is that right?
That's correct.
Given your media experience, you say you initially worked almost entirely with the Department for Media, Culture and Sport. Is that right?
That's correct.
Then in around 2005, you were asked to become the director responsible for Royal Mail Group and by extension its subsidiary, Post Office Limited.
That's correct.
Was this the first time you were involved in Royal Mail Group matters?
It was.
In June 2007, you became the chief executive of the shareholder executive.
Yes.
But you say at paragraph 7 of your statement that you stayed closely involved with the government's strategy for Royal Mail Group, given you describe as its scale, prominence, and extremely severe commercial problems.
That's correct.
In particular, you say you helped to establish the Hooper Review in 2007, which ultimately recommended the separation of Post Office Limited from its parent company, Royal Mail Group, in 2008.
Yes.
You remained chief executive of the shareholder executive until the end of January 2013. Is that right?
That's right.
In February 2013, you were appointed the permanent secretary of the Department of Energy and Climate Change,
Yes.
a role you performed until April 2016,
Yes.
when you were appointed permanent secretary of the Ministry of Defence.
Yeah. Yes.
You continued in that role until January 20... Let me just check my dates on that. Until January 2021, when you were appointed as a National Security Advisor.
The National Security Advisor, yes.
And you stepped down from that role in September 2022.
Yes.
You were then the Prime Minister's Advisor on Defence Industrial Strategy until December 2022.
Correct.
And since leaving government, you have held a number of roles, including being Chair of Rolls-Royce SMR,
Yes.
Governor of the Wellcome Trust,
Yes.
Visiting Fellow at Columbia University's School of International and Public Affairs,
Yes.
and a Senior Advisor at an investment bank.
Yes.
I'd like to turn, please, to the shareholder executive's responsibility for Royal Mail Group and Post Office Limited. Could we have on screen, please, paragraph 17 of Sir Stephen's statement, which is on page 7, towards the bottom. You explain the shareholder executive's principal purpose, starting in the penultimate line on this page. And you say SHEQ's principal purpose was to ensure that government was an effective and intelligent shareholder, working with the boards and management teams of HMG-owned businesses to ensure that they were being run in a way that was commercially effective, but that was also within the clear confines of the government's policy objectives. In your view, what was required to ensure that the government was an effective and intelligent shareholder?
In the first place, there needed to be a clear and well-articulated set of policy objectives for the companies in question. In the second place, there needed to be a clear and well-articulated set of commercial objectives also. And to the extent where that we possibly could, we wanted to ensure that the corporate apparatus and the corporate governance of the assets for which we were responsible as nearly approximated best practice in the private sector as we could as well. And in that regard, a lot of the focus was making sure that the board was properly constituted, it had the right kind of skills on it, that the chair was responsive to the shareholder, and that we kept a constant dialogue with the management of the asset and the directors of the asset, such that we would know what was going on and whether or not government's objectives were being fulfilled.
In the context of government-owned assets, did this require a balance between ensuring commercial effectiveness and ensuring that the asset operated within the parameters of government policy objectives?
Yes, it did. If there were no policy objectives at all, typically what would happen is that the government would seek to privatise the business. That would often come with a degree of regulation because clearly that's important in many businesses. But if there were no policy objectives that the government had for the business, we didn't think that it was or the government at the time did not think that it was a particularly sensible thing to hold. A good example of that would have been the tote.
You go on at paragraph 18 to say that in pursuit of that objective, the model necessarily adopted by government was that of ALBs, arm's length bodies. Why do you say necessarily there?
Because the assets managed mainly, actually, within central Whitehall would have led to very, very inefficient practices at Whitehall. So we would set up or typically there would be an organisation set up at arm's length from government in order to be able to recruit the right people to do that, and often to have certain types of pay freedoms, which would allow for private sector executives to be attracted to work for these assets in the national interest.
Could we go, please, to paragraph 23 of the statement, that is page 10. And in this paragraph, you describe Post Office Limited's social role, and you say this: POL was an unusual organisation in that it clearly had its own status and identity as an ALB, but was a wholly owned subsidiary of another ALB, RMG. As an ALB, POL had a vital social role in maintaining branches in remote and rural locations, providing government services as well as postal services, and playing an important role in financial inclusiveness. The network would always require significant subsidy if it were to be maintained at the size government policy dictated. However, significant elements of POL were commercial, including the financial services that it offered and the retail element of most post offices. As a company, it was best run by professional executives with relevant commercial experience, allied to a clear understanding of the social role the post office was expected to play. Was the maintenance of Post Office Limited's social role a government policy objective?
Yes, it was.
Put simply, was it the case that even if it did not make financial sense to keep post office branches open in rural areas, the social value of doing so justified that?
That is definitely the case, and there was at least one very wide public consultation on the size of the post office network, which happened while I was at the shareholder executive, to ascertain the exact size of that network. And I should say it required a government subsidy to keep the network at the size that government policy dictated.
Would it be fair to say that sub-postmasters running branches in rural areas, as well as their staff and post office employees employed in such branches, played an integral part in delivery of Post Office Limited's social role?
Yes, it certainly would.
In other words, the social role was not possible without people willing to run and staff the post office branches across the country.
Correct.
Would you agree, therefore, that how those people were treated by Post Office Limited was directly relevant to a key government policy objective for Post Office Limited?
Yes, I would.
Post Office Limited was a 100% owned subsidiary of Royal Mail Group pre-separation, and you observe in your statement that in normal circumstances there would not have been any supplementary government oversight of a subsidiary of a government-owned company. Do I summarise your evidence at paragraph 24 of your statement correctly in this way? The fact that there was unusually direct oversight of Post Office Limited pre-separation was a consequence of the social function that Post Office Limited network was expected to perform?
Yes, you would be correct in saying that. I should say that the oversight of directly and conversations with the Royal Mail Group's management and board members as well, because, of course, as the parent, as the corporate parent, they had responsibility for the post office.
And indeed, you say in your statement that Royal Mail Group was expected to discharge its ownership responsibilities towards Post Office Limited in a manner consistent with the government's policy objectives.
That's correct.
You observe at paragraph 31 of your statement that the types of decisions that were for ALBs to take rather than SHECs or the government would include matters which are sometimes described as operational or contractual. But you say that in your view this terminology does not always help to distinguish between those matters in which government became involved and those in which it did not. Is that right?
That is correct.
You also make clear that the government had a role in establishing policy goals and monitoring operational performance. So, in short, it would not just set the strategy for an asset and leave it to it?
That is correct. I mean, the strategy for an asset would be set in cooperation with the executives and board of the asset in most instances. And we would use much of the management information that the executives and the board of the asset were using to run the company to assist us in our own oversight of the asset.
Would you agree that the reason for this, and that is the fact that there is monitoring of operational performance and there isn't a clear-cut distinction between operational and policy, is that there may be times when the way in which an ALB conducts itself at an operational or contractual level can cause concern for ministers at a policy level?
Yes.
Particularly where, as a matter of policy, there is a social role performed by a government-owned asset, or in this case, a subsidiary of a government-owned asset. Would you agree that it is vital that there is effective oversight of key operational and contractual matters?
Yes.
Would you also agree that in order for oversight to be effective, the government must have access to adequate information about key operational and contractual matters?
Yes.
In particular, it was important, wasn't it, that operational or contractual matters which gave rise to risk were identified and monitored at every level of the governance structure?
Yes.
So those levels being the Post Office Limited executive level, the Post Office Limited board level, the SHECS level, and the government departmental level.
All of those, although you miss out the Royal Mail Group in that, you would have expected risks and operational performance measures to be for POL to have been included in the Royal Mail risk registers and management packs as well.
Indeed. Can you help at all with what, if any, training was given to SHECS employees about the circumstances in which operational or contractual matters might be relevant to wider policy or strategic considerations?
I'm not sure that in the precise terms in which you talk about it, we had specific training like that. There would certainly be an induction period when a civil servant would find themselves being assigned to a particular asset. They would learn about it, they would learn about the policy objectives, they would learn about the commercial objectives, they would learn about the asset in general, and clearly there were plenty of people in shareholder executive, certainly towards the end, who had experience of helping people through. So it was more of a conversation, really, than a specific programme.
Do you believe that SHECS's employees understood that the distinction between operations and strategy or policy was not always clear-cut?
Yes. I mean, there was a very fuzzy line between these things sometimes, and there continues to be in every organisation I've ever been involved in.
Before we come to the information sharing and risk identification and management mechanisms which were in place for Post Office Limited, I'd like to deal, please, with the question of who held the shareholder role relating to Post Office Limited and who held the policy role relating to Post Office Limited. Could we have on screen, please, paragraph 26 of Sir Stephen's statement? That is page 11. And at the start of paragraph 26, you say this: in general, SHECS would oversee the shareholder function, and usually the department, or another department, if that was where the policy objectives sat, would oversee the policy function, though in some cases this would sit with SHECS instead. Why was the general position as you describe it?
The shareholder executive was aiming to bring a distinctive capability to government which did not exist before 2003, 2004, which was that there was a level of commercial, professional expertise in overseeing these assets. So on the whole, what we would try to do would be to look at both the policy function and the commercial function in a way that had not happened before, where civil servants, policy civil servants, would typically really just look at the policy function. That gave quite a lot of latitude to the boards of the ALBs, who were then effectively allowed to run the commercial functions as they saw fit, and it was attempting to redress that kind of balance that for which shareholder executive would be was set up. I mean, on the whole, we wanted policy objectives, though, to be set and discussed with ministers who ultimately set those policy objectives by policy officials, because it was not for us to decide, for instance, whether or not the purposes of Channel 4 were going to be met by shareholder executive oversight, or indeed the purposes of the post office size of the network were going to be discharged by a purely commercial approach. So we wanted, on the whole, where we could, to get the policy objectives out of shareholder executive. We weren't always successful with that, and we weren't wholly successful on Royal Mail and Post Office.
Is it right that for the whole time you were at the shareholder executive, Shecs held both the shareholder and policy roles relating to Post Office Limited?
Yes, it is.
Is it right that this was in contrast, as you refer to at paragraph 26 a little further down, to other assets where the policy role may have been with Shecs in the early days, but it transferred to the relevant government department thereafter?
That's correct. In the Royal Mail's case, we inherited, when there was a lift and shift effectively of the whole of the Royal Mail and Postal Services team into shareholder executive. Along with that came the team that looked after things such as the requirement for 6-day universal service in the Royal Mail. We felt that gave rise to complications that were difficult to reconcile within shareholder executives, so we moved that back into the main part of the department.
As far as you're aware, why did the policy role for Post Office Limited stay within the shareholder executive?
I'm afraid I don't really recall at this time, and I wouldn't like to speculate. Actually, I don't quite recall. Clearly, we were thinking that there, in an ideal world, should be a separation between policy and commercial. Otherwise, we wouldn't have done what we did with the Royal Mail. Why we didn't do that with the Post Office at the time, I'm not sure.
Could we have on screen, please, UKGI 401339? These are the minutes of a shareholder executive board meeting which took place on the 15th of September 2010. This is a meeting at which you were present, and you comment on these minutes if you wish to refer to it at paragraph 28 of your statement. Looking please to the second page, to paragraph 2.1. This paragraph comes under a heading which was at the bottom of the previous page, Shecs Board Governance. And the minutes at 2.1 say this: Philip went through his paper on the Shecs Board's remit, particularly alerting members to the following considerations. And the first bullet point there, policy restraints. The board will give advice on the operational implications and effectiveness of policy proposals. Then at 2.2, there is this. Board members went on to discuss the board's role, effectiveness and accountability. The board saw itself as an advisory group to help Shecs fulfil its role in government and escalate issues when necessary, with accountability to SHECS. Members commented that there may be situations where the board disagrees with policy decisions, and therefore SHECS's involvement in some cases which could compromise SHECS's capability or affect its reputation. Stephen, was that you?
That was.
Stephen stated that SHECS would always start from a commercial position, but would overlay policy priorities in order to get a settled and agreed position. The concern raised here was that there may be occasions when the SHECS board disagrees with the policy position in relation to an asset. With this concern in mind, where SHECS holds both the shareholder and the policy role in relation to an arm's length body, is there a risk of a conflict between the two roles?
There could be the risk of a conflict between the two roles. Yes. I mean, I should say here, I mean, it wouldn't have found its way into these minutes because they wouldn't have been written like that. But the statement where the situations where the board disagrees with policy decisions is a peculiar one because we're talking there about the board of shareholder executive, and it's not really it's not really the board's role or place to disagree with policy decisions which have been signed off by ministers. So that is a slightly strange formulation, which I think is, in hindsight, doesn't look right to me. I mean, the point that I was trying to make in the rest of this paragraph was that in most situations, the size of the post office network being a very good example, there was going to inevitably be some form of compromise between a policy objective and a commercial objective. And it was our role to try and bring out where the trade-offs were likely to be, and then to end up with a settled and, I think I say settled and
settled and agreed.
A settled and agreed position. And that was really about getting an agreed position between the policy imperatives and the commercial imperatives. I mean, clearly, for instance, if you wanted if the policy imperative had been that we need a post office network of 20,000 branches rather than 11,500, which I think was the position at the time, that would have required a very much greater government subsidy, and clearly the trade-offs there had to be discussed and analysed properly. And it was often, I should say, easier to start from a commercial position and then work with the policy sort of afterwards. And it was an iterative process.
Could we have on screen, please, paragraph 29 of Sir Stephen's statement? That's page 12. And towards the bottom of page 12, please. Do you say here, I discussed the role of the SHECS board further below. Part of that role was to ensure that SHECS maintained a commercial outlook in its dealings with both ALBs and government departments, and to guard against a danger that the balance of SHECS activities would tilt too far away from the interests of the taxpayer. To put it in other terms, the board here was seeking to ensure that priority given to the shareholder function and the policy function remained in the correct proportion, a concern that was particularly prevalent at the time of the meeting with the new coalition government's emphasis on efficiencies. So you're referring back there, aren't you, to the minutes we've just looked at, and do look at the paragraph above if you need to for context in terms of the timing of the meeting.
I am, yes.
Yeah. And that coinciding with the new coalition government's emphasis on efficiencies.
Yes.
Did SHECS ever feel under pressure in light of the new coalition government's emphasis on efficiencies, to give greater priority to the shareholder role than the policy role?
No, I don't think that we ever felt that we were under a new, in particular, have to abide by, talks about affordability, for instance. So affordability is always something that civil servants have to think about when they are assessing policy proposals. A new government, new ministers in a new government are perfectly entitled to shift the balance of policy in one direction, and if that brings affordability sort of kind of issues along with it, then so be it. You do what you can to make sure that this new policy would be workable. It may have been the case at the time, I mean, I think it probably was the case at the time, that the coalition government's emphasis on efficiencies did mean that affordability constraints were tighter, but they were not, they were maybe slightly different in degree rather than in kind from a normal conversation that you would have.
The inquiry has heard evidence from Mark Russell, who became the CEO of the shareholder executive in 2013, that an advantage of the shareholder and policy roles being held separately for an asset is that it provides another set of eyes on key issues. Would you agree with that?
Yes, I would.
In your view, is it better practice to keep the shareholder and policy roles separate?
Yes, I do agree with that.
Are there any other reasons, apart from the reason given by Mark Russell, which I've just referred to, for that?
As I've said, reaching a settled and agreed position for a particular asset or a particular policy is going to be a function of negotiation between the various differing, completely legitimate agendas that people bring to bear on it. And in some ways, I think the clarity that is brought to those potentially differing perspectives is enhanced if the teams who are looking at the policy issues as opposed to the commercial issues are separate.
I'd like to move, please, to information sharing within the governance structure for Post Office Limited. You say at paragraph 35 of your statement that the board is entitled to expect accurate and full information to be provided to it by the executive team in order to discharge its functions. You are referring to the Post Office Limited board here, is that right?
I'm referring actually to the board of any company, whether or not it's privately owned, publicly owned, or a publicly listed company. The board has the principal responsibility for the proper running of the company, and if it is not getting the right kind of information from the executive, then that is a very serious matter.
You explain at paragraph 39 of your statement that Her Majesty's government would usually be involved in the appointment of the chairs of assets operating as arm's length bodies and might hold approval rights over other board members, but in general it would not appoint key executives, is that right?
That is correct.
In these circumstances, how did Shecs satisfy itself that the executive was up to the task of and was in fact providing accurate and full information to the Post Office Limited board?
The principal role that's not, let me rephrase that. One of the principal roles of the board is to ensure that the executive of the company is properly constituted to be able to effectively run the company. There are lots of bits of corporate governance around that which have evolved over the years and continue to evolve, but basically they go through the Remuneration and Nominations Committee. And appointments of executives are made by the board. Now, we would, as shareholder executive, have wanted to have, if at all possible, participated in the discussions around the executives' appointments. and we would have given our views if we felt that there were any particular names that we didn't think were especially suitable or were suitable. But we wouldn't try and interpose ourselves into what would be standard corporate governance. In terms of information, which is a slightly different matter, the principal responsibility of how the information comes up to the board is that of the board, and you expect to have experienced non-executive directors and chairs who would know whether or not the kind of information that they were getting was the right kind of information, whether or not anything was being elided or missed out. And there is a panoply of different types of things that would assist them in that, most notably internal audit and the company secretary and the other risk functions effectively in the board. As I say, for us, in shareholder executive, we would by and large work through that type of mechanism rather than trying to interpose a sort of totally different information regime on companies, because that would have been duplicative and unhelpful.
Could we have on screen, please, paragraph 40 of Sir Stephen's statement? That's page 19. About 4 lines down at paragraph 40, you say this: Shecs and the responsible department had to sustain and manage a close working relationship with the chairs, boards and executive teams of its assets. This was not always easy. At the time when I was chief executive, many senior executive teams were used to a culture in which they had a high degree of autonomy in how they ran the companies, as they had become used to a formerly very hands-off approach adopted by policy officials. They saw the relationship with government as being akin to that between a publicly listed company and an institutional shareholder, not that between a company and its 100% owner, or sometimes seemed to feel that they had been appointed by a Secretary of State to do a job and should be left alone to get on with it. As is discussed below, there was considerable resistance in some ALBs to greater involvement from Shecs, including Royal Mail Group and Post Office Limited, in particular with regard to the appointment of shareholder NEDs, non-executive directors. Starting with the senior executive team at Post Office Limited, when you were the chief executive of Shecs, did you see or were you aware of this resistance to greater involvement from Shecs, leading to the executive team at Post Office Limited being resistant to sharing information about operational and contractual matters with Shecs?
I did not. I was aware of that kind of dynamic at the parent, with the Royal Mail Group, but because that was where my focus primarily was. That's not to say that it didn't exist at Pol, but I was not aware of it.
Now, in relation to the Post Office Limited board, did you see or were you aware of this resistance to greater involvement from Shecs, leading to the Post Office Limited board being resistant to sharing information about operational and contractual matters with Shecs?
Again, I think my answer to that is similar to my answer from the previous one. From the papers that I have seen and have been reminded about, clearly there was a degree of reluctance towards the end of my time at Shecs for Susanna Story to go onto the board as a government non-executive director, and that may have been indicative of the kind of thing that you are talking about.
You refer at paragraph 76 of your statement to a submission that you made to the Secretary of State in December 2006. Could we have that on screen, please? It is UKGI 3045962. The title of this submission is Royal Mail Board Composition, non-executive directors. Appended to this submission as Annex B is an earlier submission. So the date of this one is the 6th of December 2006, and it's from you to the Secretary of State. The earlier submission, which is appended to it, is dated the 21st of June. Could we go to that, please? It's page 5 of this document. And we can see there, tucked underneath your name and role, 21st of June 2006, to the Secretary of State. Going over 2 more pages, please, to page 7. Paragraph 9 of the submission deals with our relationship with the board. This was the Royal Mail Holdings Board, is that right?
That's correct.
And you say here at paragraph 9, the shareholder-board relationship has been far from ideal. It is expected that there will always be some elements of tension between the two parties, but at various times over the last 3 years, the company has indulged in gaming and has tried to apply pressure on the shareholder without taking due consideration of the fact the shareholder is the government and has to work within certain constraints, albeit that we strive to act as a commercial shareholder. This has manifested itself in the company refusing or being slow in providing information, threats of resignations and insolvency, and the playing out of issues in the media. There has been no shared vision of the ideal profile of members of the board, with difficulties arising over the appointment of Baroness Prosser and the need for at least one board member to have regulatory experience. There has also been poor consultation over key executive appointments in Letters, Post Office Limited, and the finance function. In a word, trust is missing from the relationship. Focusing first on the reference to the company indulging in gaming and trying to apply pressure on the shareholder, what did you mean by gaming in this context?
Well, I give a couple of examples later on, possibly being slow to provide information, using the media to get a particular point of view across, which would have been better shared privately, generally not having the kind of trusting and straightforward relationship that we aspired to have.
And what was done to ensure that the board was no longer inclined to game the shareholder?
Well, we had a number of, probably at the time, I mean, I can't remember, it was a long time ago, rather difficult conversations with members of the board. I mean, as I say in my evidence, I wouldn't want to say that this was a sort of broken relationship because everybody was at each other's throats for no particularly good reason. That wasn't the case. This is a business which was in extremely challenging circumstances indeed. We were on the verge of having to make a very significant investment in the business to keep it solvent and modernise its operations. It had a very, very large pension fund deficit. There were different visions of how the ownership of the company, this is Royal Mail Group, should develop. On the one hand, the management wanted there to be very significant employee share ownership. Ultimately, that wasn't the government's policy. So that the context of the time was this was quite a fraught environment. I think I say later on in the document, or possibly in some of the other documents later on, that the relationships became better, but there was no question it was a fraught relationship at the time, and we had to work pretty hard to make sure that ministers' objectives were fulfilled. I mean, what made things better? I mean, there's been a suggestion, I think, at some points that ministers didn't have that much agency in the running of the businesses. I don't really agree with that. One of the things that made it better, for instance, was the appointment of Baroness Prosser, so that de facto there was a board member who was more capable of reflecting what would have been the government's objectives around the board table.
Thinking in particular of the reference in this paragraph to resentment manifesting itself in the company refusing or being slow in providing information, do you consider that there was a cultural resistance in Royal Mail Group to the shareholder having access to potentially sensitive commercial information?
I think that would be a fair characterisation, yes. Although, I should say again, this is the Royal Mail I am referring to here rather than Post Office.
Indeed. That document can come down now, thank you. You say at paragraph 69 of your statement that Royal Mail Group's culture of independence carried over into Post Office Limited, and you cite the example of resistance of the chair of the Post Office Limited board to the appointment of a shareholder non-executive director. And you say that that continued well into 2011 when plans for separation were being finalised. To what do you attribute Post Office Limited's resistance to the appointment of a shareholder non-executive director?
I think that Alice Perkins was pretty clear about her objections to having a shareholder executive, non-executive director on the board. And I think she gave 3 reasons. One of them was that there was another non-executive who didn't want to serve. One was that they thought that there would be a potential for conflict, and there was another reason as well.
We will come on to that
okay.
correspondence in due course. But from your perspective, forgive me for interjecting, from your perspective, quite apart from the reasons given, what did you think the reason behind Post Office Limited's resistance to the appointment of a shareholder, Ned, was?
A desire for independence from government. To the extent that it was manageable.
Was a cultural resistance to information sharing something which also carried over from Royal Mail Group into Post Office Limited?
I'm afraid I don't know the answer to that. I wasn't closely enough associated with the information coming out of Post Office to know.
While we are on the topic of the shareholder executive taking seats on the boards of its main assets, could we have page 33 of Sir Stephen's statement on screen, please? And at paragraph 68, you say this: "It had, in fact, long been my view that the government, through SHEX, should be taking seats on the boards of its main assets, and I thought it anomalous that it had often not done so when it was the sole owner of these companies. However, there was resistance to this proposition both within the government and the assets in the early years of SHEX's existence. From the government's side, this was due to concerns that a government board member might be associated with politically controversial decisions. From the assets side, a shareholder, Ned, was often seen as an unwelcome innovation that risked political or inexpert interference in commercial decisions." Then at paragraph 69, you say, "In my initial years in SHEX, my view that we should have been taking board seats did not prevail. For a company such as Royal Mail Group, in which management had a deeply ingrained culture of independence from government, it would have been extremely difficult to even raise the issue." Just as a matter of clarification, did you or anyone else at SHEX ever take practical steps to explore with Royal Mail Group whether SHEX could or should have a Ned on the Royal Mail Group's board, at any time prior to Post Office Limited's separation from Royal Mail Group?
We didn't take practical steps to try and put somebody onto the board. If we had done that, there would have been evidence in submissions to ministers that that was a position that we wanted them to endorse and follow through. I'm entirely sure that we would have had conversations with executives, with the chair, where I would have said something like, it's odd that government doesn't take board seats, but we never actually did anything about it.
Do you recall that actively being discussed with the Royal Mail Group board?
No, I don't, to be honest. So that would have been, that is speculation on my part.
Were any of the reasons you have cited in the remainder of paragraph 69, so namely strong pushback which might become public, destabilisation commercially and politically, and the potential resignation of the chair of the Royal Mail Group board, given to you at the time as reasons for Shecs not to have a NED on the Royal Mail Group's board?
I'm not sure that the conversation would have been had with the degree of precision that you're talking about. I think it was so much the case that the policy was not to have non-executives on the boards that these issues would have been kind of internalised in support of that position, rather than a conversation was, we ought to have a shareholder executive and non-executive director on this particular board. Well, we can't because we're going through these things. I mean, these things are all referenced, I think, in the submission that you put up a few minutes ago, which I sent to the then Secretary of State. So they were in the air. And as I think I say here, I think the idea of even raising it would have been wasted breath, to be honest.
So just seeking to understand, these were in your consideration, but they weren't necessarily reasons given to you by the Royal Mail Group board for why this couldn't happen?
That is correct, though I don't rule out that there was a conversation where I might have mentioned this to one of the board, but I don't remember it specifically.
So we are approaching 1 o'clock. I wonder whether we could keep going until 1:15, if that's all right by you, and have a 45-minute lunch, given that we only started at 12 o'clock today.
Yep, certainly. Yeah.
Thank you, sir. Could we have on screen, please, UKGI 3017395? This is the April 2008 Shecs quarterly report. Is that right?
Yes.
I'm taking that from a description where you've dealt with it in your statement, and so I think that is accurate.
Yes.
If we could go to the Royal Mail tab in this spreadsheet, please. It's tab 27, if that assists with finding it. That's it. So this is April 2008, and it is 2 years on from your submission to the Secretary of State, which we've looked at, containing concerns about the relationship with the Royal Mail Group board. And this was the state of play by this point. And we can see, just to put it in some context, the heading, the shareholder executive traffic light, under this first section, shareholder relationship. There are questions posed, and then we have columns, a yes column and a no column, and there is a code for what type of issue the yes or no relates to. So number 1 is in the summary above as the shareholder relationship. So all of those items in that first table, section 1, relate to shareholder relationship. And just looking at some of the questions and answers that we have here, The first one is, do we have regular and informative contact with non-execs? And the answer to that is yes. And on the comment, if we can just click in the box, please. We can't see the full text in the box, but if we look above to the bar at the top, where the formula bar, if I'm using the right terminology, where the cursor is, we see annual plus frequest ad hoc, new programme of meetings now commencing. Then we have the second question, do we have regular and informative contact with the chair and senior execs? The answer is yes, and there's quarterly and frequent ad hoc. The third question, does the chair respond to shareholder concerns? And the answer is no, and the comment is yes and no, often extreme, recently some improvement. Chairman's response to Secretary of State Chairman's letter acknowledges importance of monitoring and reporting the company's performance. Then we have at 1.4, does the company operate a no surprises approach to communication? Includes media? No. And the comment is inconsistent. Some off-record briefing of media, no pre-warning of high-profile press releases, getting much better, however. And it says, is the overall relationship satisfactory? The answer is yes, but the comment is satisfactory just. And at the next box down, we have as red, relationship with, and if we can just click on under red, relationship with chair can be mixed, other issues, consensus can be reached, board refresh now being undertaken, new MD letters now appointed, and new settlement with the board being slowly established. Some friction experienced over bonuses which still have not been agreed for the now previous financial year of 0708. Just looking down, please, to section 3, which is quality of management team and board. And under do we have a suitable and strong chair? The answer is yes. And we've got some comments there. Chair reappointed for further year to oversee review and poll. The answer is also yes for whether we have a suitable and strong CEO. Relationship with CEO has been strained, but it's improving. He is looking to move on in the next 12 to 24 months' time. Suitable and strong FD, is that finance director?
It is, yeah.
Yes, finance director in post for 18 months. Performance okay, but not great. New initiatives to improve reporting are often met with resistance initially, but then gradually overcome. And then looking at some of the no's, do we have a suitable and strong line management, including other executive directors, heads of business units? And the answer is no. Royal Mail undertaking refresh programme, major concerns about bench strength of team. Is there a strong NED team? 2 down. No. Strategy for reappointment recruitment being implemented. Interviews for NEDs have been undertaken recently. Is the board compliant with the combined code? Yes, but with the comment, but seeking to reduce board size. And then we have this, do we have appropriate board dynamics? No. Need to ensure that future NED appointments are truly independent and expect to do so through NED recruitment. And the last one, has there been a board performance review recently? No. Last review in 2005. Since then, there have been changes to the executive team and NED refresh underway. Do not expect full board review until new chair appointed March 2009. So looking at all of those answers taken together, would you agree that it appears from this document that the relationship with the board was still poor at this point, 2 years on?
It's certainly problematic. I wouldn't remotely want to deny that. I think it shows some signs of improvement from my earlier submission, where I described the general atmospherics around this relationship, but it is absolutely clear from this that we had not been completely successful in resetting the relationship.
What was preventing improvement, or at least making it slow?
It is difficult to make these kinds of improvements if the chair and the board have set their face against some of them. If, for instance, as I think I said in the earlier submission, the chair does not want to do a board review, then it is very difficult to do a board review. And if I remember rightly, although this was before my time in shareholder executive, I think that the chair here had brought in many of his many people he knew personally to be non-executives on the Royal Mail group. So there was quite a tight group of non-executives who would have been making improvements probably a little bit more difficult than we would have ideally liked.
Were there at this point still concerns that insufficient information was being shared with SHEX?
I would imagine that there probably was. I mean, bear in mind that the reporting packs, the requests for information, the formality and length of the meetings that we were having were changing all the time, admittedly, possibly from a sort of kind of relatively low base. But I'm guessing that we would probably have still wanted to see more types of information than occasionally we got.
What were the concerns about the strength of the executive team which were referred to in this review?
We clearly felt that we had a strong CEO, although these yes-no binary judgments are indeed just that, rather binary. And the finance director, I think, gets a tick in that box as well. I can't remember at this distance.
If I can help you with 3.4, do we have a suitable and strong line management, including other executive directors, heads of business units? And then in the comment, major concerns about bench strength of team. It was that specifically that I was referring to.
So I don't remember in any great detail, but clearly this was a comment which was recognised by the chief executive in the main, who was obviously undertaking an exercise to improve the quality of his executive team.
There were stated to be concerns about the independence of the non-executive directors on the board. Is that linked to what you've just told us about who had been selected and how?
Yes, I think it was, and I think it goes to the point here about needing to ensure that future non-executive director appointments are properly independent as opposed to anything else.
That document can come down now, thank you. So I've reached the end of one topic, and before turning to the next, I wonder if that might be a convenient moment to break for lunch.
Yeah, certainly. So we'll resume at 2:00, yeah?
Yes, please, sir.
Right, see you all then.
Thank you.